Hello all, welcome to lesson 4 of the Rook Endgames series. This lesson will be covering the defensive technique of the side check, so we also need to learn how to defend well. It's also important if you are on the attacking side to know what are the defensive techniques possible so you can attack better. So if you remember from the first lesson, the Scipione Lucena position, this is the same position. If it was white to play, then we had a simple win, but if it was black, it was a draw. Why? Because the rook is standing on the long side. The long side is the side with more squares from the pawn file. So the short side, we have the king. The long side, we have the rook, and this is the ideal situation we want if you are playing defense. And besides that, the rook is also with 3 squares away from the pawn file, which is the ideal situation to be able to use the side checks to draw the game. So let's see this happening. So we deliver a check, the king needs to come out, check again. Of course, the king needs to keep protecting the pawn, so can't go away from the pawn. Let's go for d6 here. Then we check again, and again the king needs to be relatively close to the pawn. So going, for example, over here, we just give a check and there's no progression. And if it goes, for example, over c5, then we attack directly the pawn and the pawn is lost. So it's a draw again. So there is no way the king can avoid the eternal side checks unless it gives away the pawn, like over here needs to come back and it's a draw. So don't forget this, the rook on the long side, 3 squares to the file of the pawn, and the king on short side is the ideal situation to draw this kind of endgame. Just so you see, let's move the position 1 square to the left, and now we just change the position of the rook to the short side, having the king on the long side, and this changes the outcome of the position from a draw to a lost. So it's black to play at the same, but now we check. The king comes out, check. We need to keep protecting the pawn, of course. If the rook checks, it's the same situation. So over here, if it checks, we just attack the rook, and if the rook comes, well, there's no way it's going to avoid the pawn promotion and a lost. So over here, maybe the rook wants to go to the 8th rank, so playing rook a8, but now we keep attacking the rook, and the rook goes to the other side. Now we approach the pawn, and there's no way black can avoid the promotion, and whatever, if it sacrifices or not, it's going to be a win for white. So here we have the short side with just 2 squares away, and it's a draw. It's a loss for black. Now let's see, just again, we are on the long side with the rook, but the rook only has 2 squares, and here black is lost again. Let's see this in action. So check, the king comes. It's not going to be so easy, we are going to see. The king goes to d6, and now the rook goes to b8. So this is important. So at the moment, the rook has 2 squares away from the pawn. We are believing that this is also a loss. The king attacks the rook goes to a8, so now we need to be careful because we already know that having 3 squares away from the file of the pawn is enough for the side checks to keep the draw, so it's white to play, and we need to find this very important move. This is a key move for you to remember on this end game because these positions can happen a lot. Just remember that most rook end games are common, and most of them tend to finish in a rook and pawn against rook. And most players don't go that deep to remember everything. So the more we remember, the better chances we are going to have to outplay our opponent. And here, the brilliant move is to sacrifice our own rook. So placing the rook in a2, so removing the possibility from the rook to stay with the 3 squares away and give him more checks. So the rook needs to accept sacrifice, and then we promote to queen. And here, of course, white is winning. But again, it's a queen versus rook endgame. It's not an easy endgame to master. Don't forget that. If you want, you can review my masterclass on the queen versus rook endgame. But if you are ready on the defensive side, force the attacking one to prove he also knows the techniques, because these are not easy techniques. Okay, let's move on again. So now we are going into some details. We saw now that this was a lost position for black. Now we are going to shift everything one square to the right. So we have got this position. And now black is saving the game again. So kind of strange. Okay, black is in the long side, but only has two squares away from the pawn. Yes, but we have some special situations here. First, the position of the king is perfect. And we not only have two squares to the pawn, but we also have two squares to the other side. And let's see how that helps black to keep the draw. So we check the king comes out, we check again, of course. The king keeps protecting the pawn. Again, we are going to the 8th rank, the same situation, controlling the promotion. Now, of course, if you remember, we attack the rook, and rook goes to a8. And if you remember from the last position, the special move we have is to bring the rook to cut the enemy rook from keeping side checking. And so we offer to sacrifice our rook to a2. And now black isn't obliged to take it. So black can simply play to the other available square. So as we have two squares that keep the rook away, three squares from the pawn, there's no way white can force black away from a position where it can deliver side checks. So after a while, it will have to come back, and then we simply keep the side checks alive, and there's no way white can win. And so you see how small details in the position, if we master them, we can outplay less prepared players. So be paying attention to all these details. We have one more. Do you remember I told you that the king is in a perfect position? Well, let's change it for the corner. And let's see also how this changes again the outcome of the position from a drawing one to a lost one. So again, we are going to deliver a check. The king comes back, then a side check again. But now there are differences. Why? Because the king is on the 8th rank. And so the 8th rank on this situation is a more fragile position for our rook to attack it. So we go with the king to f6. Okay, so now we are threatening checkmate. We are threatening checkmate in h2. Okay, we could use this on the previous situation. I am going to explain the small big detail. So the rook checks our king, and we move to e5. So we are now threatening to promote the pawn. So the rook can keep going with checks, of course, but this would be lost because now we are controlling. And because the king is in this uncomfortable position, we are now threatening to deliver a check, forcing the rook to take our rook, and then we take back with the promotion. So the king moves away, but doesn't matter. We still go to e8, and so now the rook can't go anywhere. And if the rook moves away, like for example, going over here, we simply promote and we have a queen. And rook versus a queen, and if it takes, well, we all know what happens if it takes, we get the queen again. So, but here, of course, black can't won't make it easier for white. And again, let's see how, if we are from the defensive perspective, we can make it very harder for the other side. We simply go to c8. We go to c8. So now we need to find a way to promote the pawn. But if we approach the king, we are going to have some checks. There's always the threat of the rook being able to have one extra tempo to keep really away, and then we can't cover all side checks. So that is an important maneuver, a very important maneuver to win this position, taking advantage of the poor position of the king. Notice that if the king was on the previous square, there won't be a check on e8, and so the rook could simply move to the side checks again, and there won't be any winning for white. But here it's different. And notice this maneuver. We are going to bring the rook to the side, to the long side, and we need to use it using the sixth rank. So we bring first the rook to g6, the king simply attacks the rook, and now we use the same technique. We attack the rook on, so attracting it. If the rook takes, we simply are playing queen vs rook endgame, which we already know it's a possibility for the defense to make it harder for white to win. If black wants to keep expecting white not to know the technique until the end, it can simply move away. But now it's white to move again, and we simply are going to bring our rook to e8. So we simply control the approaching of the king first, so the king can't approach the pawn. Then the rook needs to stay in a passive defense, otherwise we are just going to bring our rook to the 8th rank and control the promotion of the pawn. And now we simply go with the maneuver to bring the rook to e8. The rook keeps in a passive defense, and now we reach e8. And there's no side checks to save the day, because we are simply going to end them after a while, and now the rook can't avoid the promotion of the pawn if it goes over here, like for example over here. And so we got this lost. Because this lost is very easy to win, that's why sometimes here the defensive side can consider to force white to prove a win with queen vs rook, although the king here is really in a uncomfortable situation, so normally this is also an easier queen vs rook endgame. Okay, so we finish our lesson. I think this lesson brings to us new ideas for the defensive side. Also, some important techniques to remember for the attacking side. So I think it's very useful in the end. The more we know, the best we are prepared to really outplay our opponent in this kind of end games. Hope you have enjoyed, and see you in future lessons. Bye bye.